This week on the Communicators, a look at the role of freedom of the Internet in human rights and how the U.S. State Department keeps tabs on Internet freedom. Our guest is Daniel Baer, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor.
Well, this week on the Communicators, a look at Internet freedom worldwide. The State Department recently issued its annual Human Rights Report. And joining us is Daniel Baer, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Secretary Baer, why is Internet freedom included in a human rights report?
Well, I think one of the things that Secretary Clinton has brought worldwide attention to, which was perhaps not actually new when she started, it was already a story that was unfolding, is that more and more we see that the story of human rights around the world is happening online or through new technologies, broadly speaking. When we think about what most of us associate with human rights, whether it's President Roosevelt's For Freedom speech or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those rights, the exercise of those rights, whether it's freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly, those rights are increasingly unfolding online. And it doesn't mean that the offline incarnations don't matter. They still do. They're still very important, and they often work in tandem. But certainly it's hard to imagine for most of us any kind of significant world event where those rights are being exercised happening without those rights being exercised online. And so I think the inclusion of Internet freedom in the Human Rights Report is meant to reflect that reality and contribute to the comprehensiveness of the report.
When you talk about Internet freedom, do you mean freedom of speech or do you mean access to the Internet?
We mean, broadly speaking, the same rights that apply offline apply online. And so obviously freedom of speech, freedom of expression is one that is most prominent, but also freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of religion, any human right that is reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that should apply online in the same way that it does offline. There's a separate and related conversation about access, and that ties into the development of infrastructure, the spread of technology, et cetera. And certainly we recognize how those two things work in tandem, protecting an open platform and also expanding the reach of that platform. But they're distinct and complementary goals, and so and not substitutable one for the other. And so that is certainly part of the conversation. But I think when we talk about the Human Rights Report, we're talking about protecting the openness of the platform and the ability of people to exercise their rights online.
Well, joining us as well is Lynn Stanton, who is a senior editor for Telecommunications Reports, and she's our guest reporter this week.
How much correlation is there between the online human rights violations and the offline? Is it the same countries that you have concerns about online as offline, and is the degree sort of correlated between the two spheres, if you will?
I think that, as you probably would expect, there is a good deal of correlation. I think probably that speaks to the kind of indivisibility of these rights wherever they're exercised. Governments that see the exercise of freedom of expression or freedom of association as a threat to what is sometimes a regime of questionable legitimacy tend to see those things as a threat, whether or not they're happening in a town square or whether they're or an online chat room. And so for that reason, the same governments that restrict rights offline tend to restrict rights online. I think there are kind of different groups. Democracies also struggle with how to adapt and respond to new technology. They're often very well-intentioned counterparts in a variety of ministries around the world, in a variety of countries around the world, who are figuring out, okay, I start from the premise that the same rights apply online as offline, but how do I make that real given the expansion of regs that are happening in various sectors, et cetera? And so, and they make mistakes as people do. I think there's a difference not only in the approach in terms of, are we trying to shut down speech or are we trying to facilitate an open internet? There's also a difference in kind of the openness of the conversation about, okay, how do we reckon with these new technologies? What should we do? How should we respond to the challenge of developing infrastructure, et cetera? and where those conversations are happening out in the open, mistakes when they happen are corrected more easily. So there's also a correlation in the openness of the public conversation and how the internet is responded to or managed more broadly.
When in looking at it, as the State Department looks at it, do you also have problems sometimes in making the distinction? I mean, you're saying some countries may be well-intentioned and make a mistake. Do you have trouble discerning whether it is a well-intentioned mistake or even possibly a legitimate? I mean, there are some content restrictions that are legitimate, say copyright protection or child pornography, and I would assume sometimes legitimate excuses or legitimate reasons for restricting, are they cited by foreign governments, and you struggle perhaps with determining whether or not they're in fact legitimate? Or
I think you're quite right. There is kind of a set of legitimate challenges that arise, as they do offline, in terms of law enforcement or intellectual property protection. And there are some governments that start from the premise that we can manage these challenges in a principled way. And it won't be easy, and there will be times where we have to make tough calls, and we're going to get criticized, and we may, upon reflection, realize that we took the wrong approach there, and back up, rewind, and try another way. And there are other governments who opportunistically harvest those legitimate rationales or objectives for quite different purposes. And part of the challenge is, yes, drawing a distinction partly so that governments that are really seeking to undermine their citizens or repress their citizens aren't taking advantage of legitimate actions for law enforcement, et cetera, in order to justify their own nefarious behaviors.
So, well, Daniel Baer, then how do you measure internet freedom? What are the what do you use to measure that?
Mm-hmm. I think that historically, certainly 10 years ago, when the first conversations about what we now call internet freedom were emerging, most of them centered on censorship in the form of kind of web filters or blocking website access to websites, et cetera. And I think that in the last few years, there's been, partly because of, Secretary Clinton did shine an enormous spotlight on this issue 2.5 years ago when she gave her first internet freedom speech, and she's given one each year since then. But we've seen an evolution in the way that people conceive of the basket of internet freedom issues. It still includes censorship in terms of filtering in a lot of places around the world. But there's also other ways that internet freedom comes under threat. There's attacks of websites, distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks that are meant to take down either news sites or often civil society groups or NGOs, their websites, et cetera. So there's active attacks of information that's out there. There's also attacks offline of people for what they do online. So somebody posts something on their Facebook page and then they're tracked down and abused in a physical way for what they do. And that's an internet freedom issue too, not only because that person is being punished for exercising their rights online, but also because of the fear factor that contributes to and the self-censorship that it contributes to in those societies. So I think we see emerging threats like those in many different contexts. And I would say that different contexts have different doses of each of those. There's some places where the filtering is very strong and the offline harassment is less so, and there's other places where the inverse is true.
What are some of the most egregious examples that you found worldwide when it comes to restricting the internet?
Well, I think it's well known that China's restrictions on the internet are widespread, and one of the things that we've seen not only in China but in a number of other countries now is the kind of targeted censoring of going after a single blog post or something like that, in addition to broad filters, et cetera. So in terms of restrictions on what content people can access, China, others, obviously Iran and Syria are terrible abusers, not only in terms of filtering, but in tracking people down and punishing them, abusing them for what they do online, and we're seeing that unfold in front of our eyes. But I think, again, each context is different. There are a number of states where it's problematic, and one of the arguments that I try to make when I'm engaging with foreign governments is about the eventual economic trade-off that states have to make when they restrict vast amounts of information or create an environment in which the potential of the internet as a platform for sharing and exchanging information is muted by either the fear or the self-censorship that people have. And so, when I talk to governments like Vietnam, which has a new restriction that they're introducing that would make websites liable for the content that users post on their sites, these have commercial implications, not just human rights implications, and it's a place where the commercial interests and the human rights interests overlap quite a lot, and there's a case to be made in terms of these countries' ambitions for continued economic growth, that they really need to see that an open internet is part of that formula.
In terms of government monitoring and tracking of people's activity online, obviously that's a precursor to their, as you say, attacking them offline or to shutting down sites because they have to see where people are going. But is the actual monitoring and tracking a concern? Do you see that as in itself a human rights violation or an area of concern or something that you don't worry about at all until it actually leads to, another kind of violation?
Well, I think here too it's important to divide into kind of different purposes for that. Obviously there are countries, including our own, that have legitimate law enforcement interests in monitoring and tracking. That those systems are established by a democratically elected legislature, that they're executed by a democratically elected executive branch, that they're held in check by a judicial branch that is independent and able to review in accordance to constitutional principles. And so that broader context matters. It also matters, who is being, what the purpose is. And so it's hard in many countries where, like Syria or Iran, where people are monitored and tracked, the people who are monitored and tracked are not potential terrorists, but actually human rights activists who are out there criticizing or arguing against the regime, and they're not only monitored and tracked but disappeared into black vans and never seen again. It's a very different scenario, and so I think to answer your question, it does matter what the intention is, and it matters to take a look at the broader context of the protections and safeguards that are in place in various places around the world.
Well, Daniel Baer, last year during the Arab Spring, we could see the traffic in Egypt just drop. It was shut down. Essentially, the internet really was shut down. Are we seeing the same thing in Syria? And how has Egypt changed over the past year?
So in Syria, I think there is still internet traffic going on, but obviously there are restrictions, and the regime has been using technology in order to target people, which is one of the reasons why the president signed a new executive order recently that allows sanctions to be put on individuals or entities that are helping the Syrian or Iranian regime get the kind of technology that they use to target people. But we know that it's continued to be important for the Syrian people who are on the ground to tell their story to the outside world. We know from the bits of footage, et cetera, that is getting out how important these technologies can be to documenting and recording, in this case, a story of a terrible horror. In terms of Egypt, my understanding is that the internet is the shutdown that happened last year for several days. One of the things that happened there was that it wasn't sustainable to shut down. Cutting. One of the lessons that was learned was cutting off a country that has been online and taking them offline is incredibly difficult to do and to sustain. And there's economic there too. I mean, I don't remember the actual figures, but I remember there were economic estimates that came out shortly thereafter about how much money had been lost in those few days of the shutdown. And so I think part of the lesson, there are many lessons to take away and many understandings that we won't have for several years hence, I think, of the changes that have happened in the last 18 months in the Middle East. But one of the lessons we do know is that it was unsustainable to keep the internet off.
You mentioned the executive order on the technology to Syria. The same technology that can be used for perfectly legitimate reasons gets used for obviously illegitimate. And is that the way to do it, just to go country by country and say, okay, this country stepped over the line, so we need to, by executive order, stop it? Or should there be some broader way of looking at how this technology gets exported, what kind of services U.S.-based companies provide to foreign regimes?
I think there should be a broader way, and I think that we are taking a broader way. One of the reasons why the executive order was so narrowly targeted against, kind of the worst of the worst was because we recognize, as you say, that this is a space which is perhaps the best example of the concept of dual use, where things have both a potentially positive and a potentially negative purpose. And if we take as the objective that we want to limit the access of a regime to technology for the purposes of doing harm or violence or violating the rights of its citizens, but at the same time, I mean, part of the thing is not only that there are some legitimate uses for some technologies, but also the people on the ground who are trying to exercise their rights also need access to some technologies, and you don't want to catch things in the filter that they need and want in order to exercise their rights. And so we recognize that this is a difficult exercise, and that it has to be done extremely carefully, and that that's part of the reason why a couple of years ago there was a clarification of the by OFAC that free web-based software could be used in Iran, because one of there was some confusion over whether things like Gmail or Skype were violations of sanctions if they went into Iran. And so this is something we're always trying to be as refined as possible, and yet sanctions will never be the entire solution. One of the things that Secretary Clinton highlighted in The Hague in December of last year was increasingly a number of companies are really taking the lead on this, but companies of their own on their own volition or with the urging of human rights groups and others are doing internal due diligence to say, where is this product going, and can I predict what the use is? Is there a way, if I'm doing software updates, et cetera, is there a way that I can know what the use is afterward? And what steps can we take to make sure that the reasons that our products were created are the reasons for which they're being used, and the innovations that we've developed are being used in a way that will allow us to continue to innovate and make products going forward. And so I think the role of the private, this is a case where kind of putting things on blacklists, et cetera, is never going to be the whole solution. You actually need an engaged community that is focused on trying to maximize the good and minimize the bad on an ongoing basis and responding to challenges as they evolve.
You had mentioned earlier, even the U.S. has law enforcement uses that are legitimate for filtering and monitoring. How much pushback do you get as you go out and talk to your counterparts in other countries about the way they look at the internet, from them saying, well, you do this, the U.S. does this? I've heard criticisms in the debates over net neutrality and also the debate over the online piracy bills that were in the Congress earlier this year, that these kinds of approaches set bad examples, that if we mess with the DNS lookup through the piracy stuff, that's a bad example, and people will just say, why should we do what you say when obviously you, the U.S., are not a good practitioner of these same ideas?
I think that we can be, it's absolutely true that when on this and any human rights issue or any policy issue, obviously when you're raising it with counterparts overseas, they one of the things they'll look at is what you're doing at home. And I think broadly speaking, I feel enormous pride in working for the administration that there is a commitment across the board to make every effort to lead by example, and a commitment to universal standards that apply to everyone, including ourselves. And this area is no exception. I think that you're right. Some of the debates that have gone on in our country have revealed the difficulties of managing new challenges as they arise with regard to security or intellectual property, et cetera. And one of the things that we can be proud of is, frankly, the way that these things are transacted in the public sphere. People debate, people start Facebook campaigns, et cetera. They're not shut down for doing that, and they have a sway on the way politics unfold. It's almost some of these have been almost a textbook case of genuine public engagement at the grassroots level, all the way up to Congress on key issues about how to manage the emergence of new technologies. And so my response when talking to counterparts is, first of all, I do start from the premise that not only I, but my colleagues in other agencies who are working on these issues start from a commitment to principle and trying to figure out the practicalities, the nuts and bolts of the best way to approach these problems, as members of Congress, I assume, are trying to do as well. And that the good news is that as we work this out, it's exposed to public scrutiny, and when criticisms come up, they're dealt with in an open way, and that's part of that is something that that if everybody committed to that, we'd be a long way down the path.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program, our weekly look at technology and policy. And joining us this week is Daniel Baer, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And we are discussing the Human Rights Report that the State Department puts out every year, specifically the internet freedoms around the world. Lynn Stanton of Telecommunications Daily is our guest reporter. Telecommunications Reports is our guest reporter this week. Daniel Baer, on the flip side, do you, as a member of the State Department diplomatic community, how do you use the internet to encourage or promote human rights that the U.S. espouses? How do you get into North Korea? Can you get in via the internet?
Very, very few people in North Korea have access to the internet, and a large portion of those are in government ministries, I would imagine. So North Korea is a difficult media environment. It's one where radio broadcasts do reach people, and so there is increasing demand, I think, within North Korea for an opening for the ability to access information. And it's something that we continue to obviously support. North Korea is, a very, very closed environment with enormous human rights violations, and so we're focused on looking for the opportunities to widen the space for information and to get the North Korean people information from the outside that they so earnestly want. I think in terms of your broader question about how we are using the internet, I think the story is we're using the internet not only in this space, but broadly, and part of it is because of the moment we're in, where, as I said at the outset, everything is increasingly happening online and through new technologies. And under the Secretary, there's been a concerted effort to take advantage of the opportunities for 21st century statecraft, to reach out to people in more places, people that we couldn't have reached for a back and forth conversation 10 or 20 years ago, we now can. And so we have Twitter feeds in a number of different languages that reach a large portion of the world and allow us to have a back and forth, obviously in 140 characters per exchange or less, but allow us to have a back and forth on a variety of topics, not just on human rights topics, but on a variety of topics. And I think it comes at a good time because Secretary Clinton has also placed an enormous focus on connecting not only our foreign policy to governments, but to people in other countries. She gave a speech in Krakow 2 years ago where she talked about the importance of civil society and citizen change makers in being part of what supports a healthy democracy. And she, as she travels the world, makes a concerted effort to hold roundtables or town halls or meetings with civil society activists and citizens wherever she goes. And these new technologies give us an ability to allow her to interact with people virtually, as well as to allow a lot of the folks in the State Department and in our embassies around the world to keep engaged in their communities, et cetera. I visited Vietnam earlier this year and did an event with students at the American Center in Hanoi, and they can borrow iPads and Kindles, and they can access American news sites, and they interact on Facebook and other social networking sites with the American Center, and it allows us to have, and they're having conversations about current events in the world, et cetera. And so it allows us to kind of keep an ongoing conversation in a really robust and interesting and obviously contemporary way.
So do you think that if your office is sending tweets out in Farsi or your State Department website, Facebook page, are those blocked in Iran? Can those be accessed?
We know that there are, that people in various places have trouble accessing, sometimes they have trouble accessing the State Department website. They have sometimes peculiar trouble accessing the human rights reports. It turns out that those aren't always popular publications with other governments. So yes, they can be blocked. But one of the other parts of this policy that Secretary Clinton has outlined has been a concerted effort to help equip people to navigate the blocks and the hardships the threats that are brought against them. And so we have given $76 million of grants in the last few years, and we'll do by the end of this year we'll be at $100 million to programs, grants to NGOs and others who are working on tools and training and research that help us empower citizens to exercise their rights wherever they may be in as safe a way possible online and through new technologies. And so I know that while Iran does take enormous steps to limit its citizens' access to the internet, there are people who are accessing the internet. There are people who get information and who share it inside Iran as well. And so I hope that people know, I hope that there are people who can access the messages and the information that we're sharing, and I hope that certainly that they know that we care about their condition.
So, for example, who would be getting those grants?
We actually don't talk publicly about who exactly they are, but there are NGOs. There's been this is another kind of new thing. There's 5 or 10 years ago, there weren't really NGOs who are working in this space, and there has been a kind of incubation over the last few years of kind of a Silicon Valley of human rights, or I call them geeks with a conscience. These people who are at the intersection of human rights activism and new technologies, and who are coming up with the tools that allow activists to communicate with each other with greater degree of anonymity. Who come up with tools like there's one that allows you to press a button on your cell phone that wipes out your address book, so that if you get picked up off the street, they can't go after all your friends, which is what has happened. And this is, we develop these programs in response to the emerging threats that we see in a variety of contexts. And we talk to activists as much as we can. We try to identify what new bad things governments are trying to do to people, and figure out ways to help them protect themselves. And oftentimes the greatest protection is kind of what I call a digital self-defense, where they need to know the kinds of spear phishing or malware that governments are trying to get onto their computers to track their keystrokes and stuff like that. And so a lot of it is kind of self-defense training as well, which has to be passed through kind of underground railroads of trust to get to people who need it most. But we've trained over 7,000 activists around the world in the last few years.
So is the reason you don't announce who's getting these grants, is it because they actually operate inside these countries and you're concerned about their safety, or is it because too much information would make it easier for the governments to work their way around the defenses that you're giving to the activists? Or
yeah, I mean, I think generally it's obviously a sensitive area, and we want the programs to be as effective as possible. They're not covert. They're competed through publicly advertised contests, and they're extremely competitive. We get an enormous number of really interesting proposals. But out of respect for the grantees, many of whom have people on the ground who are working, we let them decide when and whether they want to disclose that they're receiving support. And we're not the only ones who are supporting them. So. And
if you would like to read the State Department's report, state.gov is the website. We have been talking on the Communicators with Daniel Baer, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Lynn Stanton of Telecommunications Reports, Senior Editor, has been our guest reporter.